So the Canon 7D Mark II, it's now well over 3 years old and is currently the oldest camera in the Canon lineup, so presumably it is the next camera that is going to see upgraded. And the rumour mills are already going crazy about what we can expect to see in terms of suspected specifications from the 7D Mark III. Try saying that when you're drunk. So pretty much everybody can be sure that the replacement for the 7D Mark II is going to be the 7D Mark III. However, a lot of people can't decide what the specifications of the camera is going to be. So for example, currently the suspected specifications are along the lines of a 30 megapixel sensor, shooting 12 frames a second, taking the 61 autofocus point from the 1DX Mark II, shooting 4K video, and potentially not having an anti-aliasing filter. And I think they're wrong. So what do I think we can expect to see from the Mark III? Well, I actually think it's probably going to be more like a 24 megapixel sensor shooting 12 frames a second, a 65 autofocus point system, no 4K video, and an AA filter. So how have I come to these conclusions? Well, inherently Canon's upgrade system seems to follow a bit of a pattern, not only with how they upgrade cameras from their previous generations, but also how they like to have their cameras fit compared to each other within their lineup so that cameras don't tread on each other's toes. So let's go with what we agree on first, 12 frames a second. So with the 7D basically being a budget level 1D, i.e. designed for sports, wildlife, fast action, that sort of thing, it inherently has a fast shooting speed. However, Canon like to keep the 7D series slightly slower than the current 1D line, just so there's no crossover. So for example, when they had the original 7D out, which shot at 8 frames a second, they had the 1D Mark IV shooting at 10 frames a second. That was then replaced by the 1DX that was shooting at 12 frames a second, and then they brought out the 7D Mark II, which shot at 10 frames a second. Now we have the 1DX Mark II, which shoots at 14 frames a second, so going up by 2 every time and staying 2 short of the 1D would kind of suggest that 12 frames a second is about right. Resolution, however, I think the rumours are being a little bit optimistic. As I said, with the 7D being focused more towards sports and wildlife, that sort of thing, Canon inherently seem to like to keep the resolution of their 7 series and 1 series lower than the rest of the lineup. This is presumably for smaller file sizes so that it can clear its buffer out quicker. Also, being a sports camera, you're more likely going to be shooting at higher ISOs, so you're going to want good noise performance, and a big part of that is going to be having that lower resolution. The other thing as well is data throughput. So every time you take a picture, that information has to be taken off the sensor, run through a processor, put through a buffer, and then copied onto a memory card. The more megapixels you put in and the faster you're shooting, the more information the camera has to process. So Canon's current flagship camera, the 1DX Mark II, shoots 20 megapixel files at 14 frames a second, which means it's having to process 280 megapixels every second. By comparison, if the 7D Mark III does shoot 30 megapixel files at 12 frames a second, that's 360 megapixels it's having to process. Now that is going to take a hell of a lot of processing power. Now granted, the 1DX Mark II is using dual digit 6 plus processors, while it's safe to say that the Canon 7D Mark III is probably going to have dual digit 7 processors, so might have more processing power, but it seems highly unlikely that Canon are going to sabotage their flagship camera with a budget version that shoots almost as fast with 50% higher resolution. Plus there's then the factor of storing all of that information. The 1DX Mark II can only shoot its maximum speed and get the most out of the camera if it's using a CFast card. The 7D series, much like the 5D line, uses compact flash and an SD card. Compact flash is not going to be able to cope with the kind of throughput that 30 megapixels and 12 frames a second is going to rely on. The 5D Mark IV shoots 30 megapixel files but at barely half the speed. So if they do go down the line of a 30 megapixel sensor, they're going to have to switch it to a CFast card over a CF card. That means a lot of the potential people looking at this camera, i.e. people upgrading from the Mark 1 and Mark 2, are going to have to swap all of those CF cards for CFast cards, and they don't come cheap. If we go back to the relationship between the 7 series and the 1 series, you'll see another pattern start to form. So the 1D Mark IV shot at 16 megapixels, while the 7D Mark I shot at 18 megapixels. The 1DX then jumped up to 18 megapixels, and the 7D Mark II jumped up to 20 megapixels. The 1DX Mark II then leapt up to 20 megapixels, so logic would say that the 7D Mark III is going to take the similar sort of step up to 22 megapixels. However, I think it far more likely that Canon are just going to employ the 24 megapixel sensor that they already have using in the 80D, the 77D, the 800D, the EOS M5, the EOS Ms, basically every crop sensor camera that Canon now produce. But it is a really good sensor. It's been thoroughly tried and tested. It's got much better dynamic range than what was in the 7D Mark II. So that alone is probably going to be enough of a justification for people to upgrade before you even throw in a load more extra megapixels. I think we will see a 30 meg sensor from Canon, but I don't think it's going to come in the 7D Mark III. The sensor in the 7D Mark II was actually taken from the 70D, which was then replaced with the 80D using the 24 meg sensor. So I think it's far more likely that Canon are going to use the 24 meg sensor in the 7D Mark III and then introduce a 30 meg sensor into the 90D and then whittle that down through the ranks following. So next, autofocus. There's been a lot of mentionings that Canon are going to take the 61 autofocus point system out of the 1DX Mark II and the 5D Mark IV and implement it into the 7D Mark III, but I don't think that is likely. I think it's far more likely that Canon are going to stick with the 65 point autofocus system that they introduced in the 7D Mark II. Reasoning. That 61 point system that's in the 1DX Mark II and the 5D Mark IV is a revised version of the same 61 autofocus point system that was found in the original 1DX and the 5D Mark III. Those cameras and that autofocus system were already on the market when the 7D Mark II was released, so Canon could have used that 61 point system in the 7D Mark II, but they didn't. Instead, they designed a brand new 65 point all cross type autofocus system specifically for the 7D Mark II. And despite that autofocus system in the 7D Mark II being an absolutely awesome system, it's only ever been used in this one camera. Because when Canon released the 80D, they designed another 45 point system, presumably so that the 80D wasn't too close to the 70D. So it seems far more likely that rather than ditch a system after only one use, Canon are far more likely to keep the 65 point system, but maybe just give it a few tweaks and then couple it up with the dual Digix 7s rather than the Digix 6 in the Mark II for even faster performance. Now for the controversials. To 4K or not to 4K? There's absolutely no doubt that Canon has the capability to put 4K into pretty much any camera. They were the ones that spearheaded video in DSLRs in the first place with the original 7D. However, in recent years, Canon have been very reluctant to really push the video boundaries any further, presumably because they don't want to sabotage their Cineline camera. So can Canon put 4K into the 7D Mark III? Absolutely. Will they? I doubt it. Apart from the 1DC, which was released a few years ago, Canon haven't put 4K in any DSLR until the 1DX Mark II and the 5D Mark IV. However, both of those came under heavy criticism for the codecs that was being used and the heavy crop factor. Because Canon insisted on using an MJPEG format so that people could pull complete 8 megapixel stills from the camera, it means that they've had to take just the center 8 megapixels of any sensor, which means that something like the 30 megapixel sensor of the Canon 5D Mark IV, reading only the center 8 megapixels, puts a crop factor of 1.7, which is even higher than the crop factor from an APS-C camera. So if they did go ahead and put 4K into a 7D Mark III, how would they go about doing it? If they were to release it with full sensor readout, that would give it less of a crop factor than the crop factor of the 5D Mark IV, which is its closest rival for 4K video. If they do put a crop factor on it, they're walking straight into Micro Four Thirds territory, and people would probably be more inclined to buy a GH5 and a speed booster rather than a 7D Mark III. Then there's the codec. MJPEG is outdated rubbish, and nobody can understand why Canon used it apart from to not sacrifice their Cinelines. So nobody wanted MJPEG in the 1D or the 5D. So if they put it in the 7D, nobody's going to care. If they switch codecs and go with something more usable like H.264 or H.265, then that's going to then tread on the toes of the 5D Mark IV, which Canon wouldn't do. If they were rolling out 4K, I think they would have done it in the 6D Mark II as well, but they didn't. So I think, unfortunately, it's far more likely that we're going to see 1080, 60 frames a second as per usual. So the 7D Mark II could shoot 1080p at 60 frames a second. However, the dual pixel autofocus wouldn't work at 60 frames a second. It would only work at 1080, 30 frames a second. So I think it likely that we'll see 1080p, 60 frames a second, but with working dual pixel autofocus. Despite the likes of Nikon dropping the AA filter a few years ago, Sony not using AA filters, Canon insists on keeping the AA filter in. Now, a lot of people are hoping that Canon will finally step up to the plate and drop the AA filter from the 7D Mark III, but again, I don't think it likely. And not because Canon aren't capable of removing the AA filter, but I think they won't do it because it's going to tread on the toes of their other cameras. A few years ago, Nikon tested the water with the AA filter. They released the D800 which had an AA filter and the D800E which didn't. And they soon realised that the majority of people didn't want an AA filter, so they replaced both of those cameras with the D810, which didn't have an AA filter. And since then, they haven't released a single SLR that has an AA filter. Now, a little while after that, Canon tried the same sort of thing with the 5DS. They released the 5DS, which had an AA filter, and they released the 5DSR, which had a AA cancellation filter. But since then, we've seen several more SLRs released from them, including their flagship cameras, all of which still having an AA filter. So Canon have clearly decided that an AA filter is the way they're going to go. So considering the big advantage from dropping the AA filter is greatly improved sharpness within the image, I think it's a very risky game from Canon if they were to drop the AA filter from the 7D Mark III, given that in terms of sharpness, a 24 megapixel crop sensor camera without an AA filter is probably going to be very, very close to the 20 megapixel full frame camera with an AA filter that's found in the 1DX. So I think if you then go ahead and offer people either a 1DX Mark II or a 7D Mark III with a higher resolution sensor but no anti-aliasing filter that can shoot at 90% of the speed but for half the price, most of the people are going to want the 7D Mark III, and that's going to detract from the 1DX. In terms of body design, I think it's going to stay exactly the same as the 7D Mark II. I don't think it's going to have an articulating screen, however, I do think it will be a touchscreen. In terms of button layout, I think it's pretty much going to stay the same as the 5D3, 5D Mark IV. Anyone upgrading from the 7D Mark II, it's going to feel like home from home for them. They didn't include Wi-Fi in the 7D Mark II because apparently they couldn't get it to work with the magnesium alloy body, but since then they've released the Wi-Fi enabled SD card that gives you full control. Also, we've seen Wi-Fi introduced in the 1DX Mark II and the 5D Mark IV, both of which also use very similar magnesium alloy bodies, so I think it's safe to say that we are going to see Wi-Fi in the 7D Mark III. So there you are, that's my predictions for specifications of the 7D Mark III. But what do you guys think? Do you think I'm on the right sort of lines? Do you think I'm talking complete rubbish? Leave your comments down below, let me know what you think. If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button so you can be the first to see all my new videos. If you did like the video, please give it a thumbs up, it is always appreciated. And until next time, I will see you later.